Howdy, and welcome to the show. Cooper's Code focuses on legal issues and notable practitioners, distilling wisdom so we all achieve the best results for our clients. I'm Miles Cooper. Thank you for joining us for this part 2 of our 3-part series with Nathaniel Leeds. I want to explore a little bit about supplemental ways that you use when you are getting into a case in an area that is new to you. And I'm using some of my historic knowledge. I know that you worked on a significant brain injury case involving neurosurgery. And as we were writing, you were talking about books you were reading. I think it was When the Air Hits Your Brain was a book on neurosurgery. And the way that you just kind of drill into one of your bigger cases to become a subject matter expert. Can you talk a little bit about how you dive into material like that?
I think I'd push back on the idea that I'm ever an expert. Okay. I mean, I think that the second that an attorney in my area thinks they have expertise is the moment,
I should clarify my comment. When I say subject matter expert, I don't mean being more expert than the trained neurosurgeon themselves. I mean someone who has the ability to gather all the information, read the literature, read the regulations, and bury themselves in the information so that you may not out-expert the expert, but at least you have an understanding of what the person is talking about when you're in the room with them.
I mean, it's kind of an interesting question because I don't know that knowing a lot is necessarily an essential skill in the deposition. The essential skill in the deposition when you're with somebody like that is to be sensitive to what more they can tell you and to how they're making those decisions. And the books you mentioned, When the Air Hits Your Brain, that's a wonderful book. I mean, for any of your listeners, about the really gory things that happen in, the context of brain surgery and kind of what stresses and what pressures people are under. And understanding that kind of global stuff, what does this environment look like? How much death are people experiencing? How many bad outcomes are people experiencing? What are the pressures of these decisions? Helps you bring people out to tell you how they're making the decisions at that time. And, it just is a way of getting people to talk. I mean, I think the other thing to say is that, although I'm not an expert on medicine, I'm always conscious of the essential skill of an attorney. And the essential skills of attorneys are very different from the essential skills of doctors, right? What an attorney is good at is looking backwards and creating history. That's the same thing you're doing in any case, is you are, something bad has already happened and you're going back and looking at that history and creating a historical narrative. What doctors are very good at is they're very good about thinking about the future potential horrible things that can happen. They don't look backwards that much. They look back maybe 10 minutes or 20 minutes or maybe a couple hours to figure out where we are on this trend. Maybe if they're in an oncology situation, they'll look back further because those tend to move slower. But, the doctor's main skill is seeing forward what the potential hazards are and avoiding them. Those are very different skills. And I think that one of the disservices that doctors do when they come and sit for depositions is they don't appreciate how much time we're going to spend building that narrative. You have a doctor who is involved in care, maybe for a morning, maybe for an afternoon, maybe for a couple hours. I will have been involved in the case for 2 years. I'm going to know and have built out an architecture of everything that is happening in a level of detail beyond what a medical professional would ever have the time or interest to build out in their practice area. So, it's kind of become, that question of expertise. I think I'm an attorney, right? My job is a storyteller. It's to build the story so I can ask the right questions. It's to build a story so I can convince a jury. And that's the job of an attorney. And whether you're doing it, I've litigated, before I was a medical malpractice attorney, I was, associate running around doing all sorts of stuff. I've done legal malpractice cases, I've done construction cases, worked with a guy who did coin-operated amusements at dive bars. It's always that same skill, is what is the history? How do I build the history? And how do I leverage the history to understand where things broke down? And so that's how I approach it. I mean, that is what we do as attorneys.
That leads me to a question. If you had the criminal exposure, you had the other associate attorney exposure, other types of cases exposure, what led you to where you are now? Was it a passion? Was it an interest? Was it coincidence that you found yourself in what I think of as a very challenging? There's a reason I don't do medical malpractice. I think it's complicated. I think it's challenging. And I think that while I like high stakes, I don't want to spend $200,000 on a case to have it not be a case.
I was thinking about that this morning because I knew that this question would probably come up. What I'd say is, my story is one that should be instructive for younger listeners. I did not come to medical malpractice necessarily out of a passion. I mean, I found the passion when I ended up in medical malpractice and as I started having success doing it. And at this point in my career, it's richer, more rewarding every year. And I think that a lot of people who end up in specialized fields will say that, is that, as they become more steeped in the field, it becomes more rewarding.
And I'm going to insert that we hear all the time, find a passion and the money will follow. And yet, just recently, I was listening to an interview of, I think the fellow's name is Scott Galloway, a marketing professional, who says, develop a talent and you'll develop a passion for the talent as you do the work.
I'd say that's true. I would say that, if you're looking at professional development, there's kind of two strategies you can employ. One is you can go after attractive things. Okay. You can say, hey, there's this really exciting, glamorous, lucrative place where people are lauded for their skills. And boy, I like that. I want that adulation. I want that money. I'm going to go for that. And the people who are going to excel in those areas are going to be competing against a bunch of other people, right? The person who becomes a Solicitor General in the United States, awesome job, right? Completely amazing, argues in the Supreme Court all the time. Think about how many people wanted that job and didn't make it there. The person who makes it to that realm, the person who makes it as a quarterback in the NFL, outcompeted a lot of people and is a combination of extremely talented and extremely lucky. I never thought I was particularly talented or lucky. So if you don't think of yourself as particularly talented or lucky, and you think of yourself as kind of a middle of the pack person, which I've always thought of myself as, then use a different strategy. Don't get into an area in which you have to compete with a bunch of people. So I was a good criminal prosecutor. I experienced a lot of advancement there, but I was a very mediocre associate. And part of the reason that I stopped being an employee at firms is I just didn't think I was going to succeed at it because I was just not. It was not something that was giving me a lot of satisfaction. I wasn't very talented at it.
And to put some meat on those bones, you did that both as plaintiff side, personal injury, and then when you came back from the criminal prosecution side, you had a number of stints at some pretty high profile insurance defense firms.
And I worked with some very brilliant people there. It was great exposure. I was very fortunate. Hopefully at some point you'll interview Guy Calladine, one of the best attorneys out there. I was very fortunate to work with Guy Calladine. But I knew that, what it took to be a really good associate were not skills that I had. I've never been a particularly precise writer. I've never been particularly good at, intuiting what other people want out of me. And at the time, I had a lot of my own ego needs. So when I set out, I basically said, okay, well, I don't have kids yet. I don't have a mortgage. This is a good time for me to try, litigating out of my back room in my house and see if it works. And when I set out, I basically said to myself, well, everybody I know is an attorney. Those people are going to take the high quality work. There's no reason they're going to give me that profitable work. So if I'm going to be successful, I'm not going to just do it on my own brilliance. Very few people do. Maybe I'm that brilliant. I don't think I am. I have to do something nobody else wants to do. And so I had three ideas. I said, well, I want to do something nobody else wants to do. And also I didn't have really the capacity to do something that required a lot of discovery. So when you're talking about, some areas of practice, as I'm sure everybody knows, you don't know whether you have a case until you've done a lot of discovery. I thought of employment that way. I said, there's a lot of employment work out there, but, it's going to be hard as a solo just to do it. So I wanted cases that were kind of case in a box, which is all the discovery is front end. So, in medical malpractice, very little discovery, right? We're entitled to our medical records. That's the discovery you have to do. I looked at that. I looked at legal malpractice. I looked at insurance bad faith. Well, nobody ever called me on an insurance bad faith matter because those are more appealing. And nobody ever called me on a legal mal because similarly, those are pretty appealing. But medical malpractice is something where a lot of personal injury attorneys, they hear medical malpractice and, back in the day, Rolodexes would go to the Rolodex and say, well, who can I call? And so I kind of got into it with that humility of saying, I'm not going to outcompete people to get to the top ranks of these more desirable practice areas. And I don't have the personality to stick in an organization to kind of slowly advance up into an organization to succeed that way either. People who have those skills can find mentors. They'll stay in an organization that has some advantages in those competitive advantages in those areas. I said that just wasn't me. So I looked for an area that was unappealing, that I thought I may have some competitive advantages at. And, I tried a bunch of different things, and the one that stuck was medical malpractice. And, initially I kind of said, well, I like this, but this was before the fees were raised. And, you can imagine funding medical malpractice cases on my very meager personal savings at that time was, a frightening thing to do. And, over the years, I developed talent for it and enjoyed it, and I continue to enjoy it. But I think the lesson is not go towards your passion, especially if you're young, because the things that you're passionate about when you're young, young people just aren't that creative, right? They've only been exposed to a couple things. It's like you ask every high school student with some athletic ability, what do you want to be? And, their answer is, I want to play in the NFL. Well, that's just because they haven't been exposed to a lot of other things that they think that's the only option. The same thing is true for attorneys. Going into law school, everybody wants to work in impact litigation. Well, you better be the best if that's what you want to do. Probably there are a lot of people who want to be prosecutors for the Southern District of New York. Well, okay, that's great. The best will get to do that. Most of us, I wish I could say I was the best and the smartest, but most of us aren't. Most of us are a little bit better than average or about average. And so, if that's who you are, then either you need to make, if you have good relationship skills, you go into an organization where they'll groom you and educate you. If you don't have the skills to stay in an organization, then look for something nobody else wants to do. Give it a try, and you may get lucky and find out that actually it's a huge amount of fun and you enjoy it. And that's kind of what happened for me.
I appreciate, and I think our listeners will really appreciate the somewhat self-effacing way that you have structured your career. I'll push back on that a little bit. And where I'll push back on that is as I look at the people who truly succeed when they get to the medical malpractice realm on the plaintiff side, they tend to be, and I'm thinking of you, I'm thinking of Jeff Mitchell, I'm thinking of Theo Emerson, I'm thinking of the walk-up lawyers, and all the others who I'm not naming at this point. Those who tend to be at the top of their game are people who have a curiosity and an intellectual firepower that I think sometimes exceeds your standard run-of-the-mill personal injury lawyer. I think of myself somewhat as a knuckle dragger as far as that is concerned. I can package things well and I can tell a story, but on the medicine side, I'm not going to be able to tell you all about an aortic dissection in the same way that you can get into the medicine and then present a case strategy to a potential client in a short enough time to be able to win that client's trust.
Well, that may be true. But it's very difficult to figure out whether that's aptitude or, it's kind of nature versus nurture, right? I think if you had found yourself without any other options, you would have figured out that that's what you are good at. And then you would have developed those skills.
Your background with having a mother as a physician, or your experience going through oncology treatment yourself, did that inform any of your experience or ability to be able to parse these issues?
It informs everything I think about every single day. Whether it has made me effective or not, I don't know. Right? I mean, I can't run the counterfactual, right? I can't imagine myself without those life experiences and know what aptitudes or interests I would have. I think I will say that having a mother who is a physician demystified the doctors to some extent. And, there's times when, my mother was not, she was a good doctor. She was not a very successful doctor. She was not good at business, and she was quite an aggressive personality, and she rubbed people the wrong way. She was not somebody who was going to work well in hospital politics, and in fact didn't. And had, we were talking about there are times when all the attorneys tell me, go after this person. Well, that was my mom. And she was, towards the end of her career, as much a malpractice defendant as she was a doctor because of the enemies she made. And I remember the stress of the life that she had, kind of being that person. And, there are times when I'm in deposition and, I've got a doctor who, has made a horrible mistake or has come to terms with that. And I see my mother. I see the strain of that profession. So I do think that people who you're not empathetic towards will not talk to you. I feel a lot of empathy for the doctors that, I interact with, and frankly, the doctors that I sue. They've got very dedicated people with very challenging jobs. It doesn't change that when they don't live up to the standard of care that they're going to have liability, but it is not an easy thing for anybody. As often as not, when we have a very strong case, I will avoid taking the target defendant's deposition as long as I can, just to give them an opportunity not to have that experience. So it's really hard to know who I would be, but for the components I have.
On the empathy side, you and your mom went through different cancers, but through cancer at the same time, correct?
Yes, we did.
About how old were you, and what kind of a cancer did you experience?
I had a weekend cancer. I had a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Most of those are caught pretty late. I was very fortunate. I caught mine stage 1. There was a very dicey about 6 weeks while they were still staging me, but by the time I had been staged, it was pretty clear that this was going to be an unpleasant road with some risks, chemo, radiation, but, it was pretty clear that I was going to get out of it.
Approximately how old were you?
It was right before my 25th birthday, I believe. My mother, on the other hand, had breast cancer, and she was stage 4 at initial diagnosis. So her life expectancy was initially thought to be about 6 months. And she, lived, I think it was consistent with her kind of the strength of her personality. She lived for 8 years. In the course of that, struggled mightily with, not just the problems with the treatment, but also with physicians who were abandoning her, with significant depression, at times psychosis. And so, if she was playing a whole 9-inning baseball game, which we knew she was going to lose, I got to sit there and be her second base coach for 1 inning. And so there was a brief period where we were both doing cancer, but, it's a very different thing when you're going to survive it. And this is, weekend cancer from somebody who knows they're not going to survive it and that they're just doing their best to fight off the inevitable.
Do you think that informs and bringing it back to empathy, both from the perspective of your ability to listen to your client's story and tell their story to a jury, and also be empathetic in a way to be in a room with a deponent, and as you were talking about with the target defendant?
I'm not sure that the cancer does that. I do think that the experience of having having a medical malpractice defendant as my mother did that. I still, in my office, look at every cancer case. There are very few of those that turn out. And at some point I will stop. But everybody knows that when a cancer case comes in, I want to go to the literature myself. And, there's wonderful literature on cancer and cancer treatment. And it's, I think some of the most marvelous literature that Western society, our global society has produced. And I will go, and I like going to it. And mostly they're not cases. And I'm always inspired by how much thought and attention people have collectively put into the treatment of cancer.
As you're talking about doing deep dives into the literature in cancer treatment, are we talking about statistical analysis, taking advantage of some of your math skills, or are we talking about something else? What are you looking for there?
I will say that, early in my career, I would actually do some of my own statistical work. And at one point I got access to the government cancer database and was running analysis myself through there. I don't do that as much anymore.
I want to follow that up for a second. I know that you went to the University of Chicago, which is known for its math department. Is that a strength of yours?
We were talking earlier about not being the best. In math, only the best survive. So compared to the other math students that I encountered at the University of Chicago, I was not a particularly talented math student. I had enough talent to sit in the classroom with them, but the difference between me and the talented math students was light years apart. And frankly, the top one or two in the class were light years ahead of everybody else in the class. And then I knew those people, and many of them went on to realize that they were middle of the pack in their graduate programs, and that the best in their graduate programs were another light year ahead of them. It's very much, as I was saying before, one of those fields like being a solicitor general or being a quarterback in the NFL. You can be very good, but you're not going to be that.
But this hasn't prevented you from having the skill set to, say, take apart an economist report or statistical analysis in a way that I don't know many other lawyers doing in the same way.
I would say that's true, but I'd say that there's a caveat there, which is, and it's something that I've had to learn in my career, you can never be smarter than your jury. It doesn't help you.
Unpack that.
You are not going to, in the course of a smart direct examination or cross-examination, teach a jury math or mathematical intuition or the fundamentals of statistics or probability. It's not going to happen. Those are things that take years and an aptitude and an interest to develop. And so if you're looking for things that are going to be rhetorically persuasive, if you think going out and just being the smartest math student in the room in front of a jury is going to get you there, it won't. And so, as I said, I used to do more of that stuff because, there's always a temptation, I think, in law to play to your strengths. You say, I'm good at this thing, so I'm going to do the thing I'm really good at. That might not be what your jury wants. What you have to do is you have to learn to play to your jury's ability to understand. And so, I think that over the course of my career, one of the struggles that I've had, if you talk about talents and aptitudes, your talents and aptitudes can be your worst enemy in law and legal practice because you'll gravitate towards them. And what you'll do is, for me, that kind of mathematical complexity was something that was always a safe space for me. It was something I was very good at in high school. It was something I was very good at college. It's something that I continue to feel pretty confident in. It doesn't allow me to explain things to people because my juries don't understand those concepts. So it may give me the intuitions to get to something that I can explain to a jury, but it's that second part, which is the lawyer's job, is to understand where your audience is and to meet them there. Don't expect them to meet you on your turf or on where you feel comfortable playing. You have to present to them. We're in the service business. We're in the teaching business. We're not in the self-aggrandizement or congratulation business. As far as, my skill set, I'd say, useful, but not as useful as I used to think it was.
Thank you for listening, and tune in next week for part 3 of this 3-part series. Please email us at podcast@coopers.law with questions, comments, feedback, and suggestions on ways in which you have approached medical malpractice cases. Like what you heard? Share us with a colleague and leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. To all of you doing justice out there, happy hunting.